follow my train of thought. I'll give it a shot. So what did we find? Well, you can break Yemen down into sort of two broad categories in terms of territory: zones of control and zones of contestation. So who controls which bits of Yemen? So in the northwestern and highland Yemen, we see a pretty big chunk of the country, certainly the main population centers of the country, under the control of what was the Houthi-Saleh alliance. After the split of Saleh from that alliance in December of last year and the victory of the Houthis over Saleh and associated forces, really just Houthi areas of control. And that's part of this broader narrative. There is support for the Houthis from Iran, but more importantly, and again we'll come back to this, they've been able to control the key economic levers in the northwest of the country, including the key smuggling networks that lead up into the northwest of the country, and they've been able to trade relatively freely with much of the rest of Yemen. But beyond this is where the story breaks down. So here in Marib and Al-Jaf and in the north of Hadhramaut, so really sort of quite tribal areas, northern Hadhramaut's pretty sparsely populated, what we see is a mix of two sets of forces, tribal groups, mainly Sunni, Shafi'i in nature, and military units and individuals, groups who are part of the broad Islam network and can be described as loyalists or allies of Ali Mohsen al-Ahmar, a key part of the Saleh regime who split from the regime in 2011, was seen as being an Islamist. Many people in this town would argue that he may or may not have been foundational in allowing al-Qaeda to form in Yemen. That's a different conversation for a different day. But he's really been a key player in bringing various different forces together to fight against the Houthis since the war began, with the sponsorship of Saudi Arabia and in a partnership which looks increasingly unequal with Abdurrahman Mansur Hadi, who has generally stayed out of military affairs. Now, what we see in the south of the country is many different territorial divisions. So the Houthis were first really sort of given a beating, were first defeated territorially in the south, first in Aden, down here, and then across what we call the tribal south. Now, in mapping what's going on in the south, many of you are Yemen experts, so you'll know that there is a secessionist movement in the south of Yemen, but that secessionist movement has not been very good at becoming a coherent, single, unified force over the 2 decades plus that it's been around. And what we've seen is that you've got various different networks across the south that have been able to take over areas of territory where they are indigenous, where they're local to that area. So if I look to Lahej, which is this governorate down here, the main militias and military forces are led by Lahjis, or Lahkis, because it's the south of Yemen, and are driven by sort of internal politics, but cooperate with key security figures down here in Aden. And the same really goes for all these governorates across here in the tribal south. Aden remains really a zone of contestation between figures backed by and allied with the Hadi government, between southern secessionists sponsored by the United Arab Emirates, who are the main sponsor of most of the military groups and militias across the tribal south. And here in the south of Hadramaut, which tends to look a little bit more like something separate from the rest of the south. We've seen the Nukhba forces, the Hadrami elite forces, taking over from al-Qaeda at the beginning of 2016 and really building out a power base here in the south, but not being able to enter the north of the governorate as a military force because of the presence of both people allied with Ali Mohsen and Islah and former loyalists of President Saleh, who really have kept control over this area, which is also key to smuggling networks. And then out here to the east, we've got Al-Mahra, which I think that you should look out for the next Chatham House paper on to get more detail on, otherwise we're going to get really lost in the weeds. Now, one of the key issues within these areas, within the government-controlled areas, is the difference in agenda and the internal rivalries. Southerners in general, so secessionists in general, have a bit of a distaste for Ali Mohsen al-Ahmar, who led the military campaign against the secessionist movement in 1994 and used Afghan Arab returnees from the Afghanistan war to really put down the secessionist movement, leading to some pretty nasty violence in the wake of the war, and also was really key in redistributing land across the south to his key loyalists, people who took part in the war. So not a man who's much loved by any of these forces down here. Similar attitude among Southerners towards Islah in general, which played a key part in bringing many of these forces together during the 94 Civil War. And then, of course, we see an axis of control, which is tribal and Islah guys sitting here. So these guys aren't particularly friends. Then we have the issue of the external sponsor. The United Arab Emirates has a pretty clearly stated position on the Muslim Brotherhood across the region as a force. And certainly we've seen a lot of reports about detention, extrajudicial detention of people who are seen as being Islah affiliated across the south, accused of being members of Al-Qaeda, among other groups, and treated not very nicely. So real tensions here between this structure here and this structure here, and not much coordination between the two. And then Aden becoming this really important flashpoint where, for example, in February of 2017, we saw fighting between Hadi-affiliated forces, members of his presidential guard, and members of UAE-backed militias within Aden who controlled the airport. Hadi wanted to get the airport back because this militia had turned an aeroplane with one of his key military commanders back from the airport. They went in to try and take it over, and what we saw was an Apache helicopter taking one of the technical vehicles the Hadi guys were using out with a missile. So we had fighting within the coalition briefly, and that in turn led to this campaign here along the west coast.
Who's this?